5 foods changed how my body handled sugar after menopause. Not a diet, not a list of things I stopped eating. 5 foods, and one habit about how I ate them that mattered almost as much as what was on the plate. I didn't cut carbs. I still eat bread. I still eat fruit most days. What changed wasn't what I was avoiding. It was what I started adding, and in what order I added it. I remember sitting in my doctor's office at 60, looking at a lab result with the words insulin resistance on it, and feeling genuinely confused. I hadn't changed my diet in years. If anything, I was eating more carefully than I had in my 30s, cutting back on desserts, watching portions the way I always had. My doctor wasn't alarmed, but she wasn't particularly explanatory either. She mentioned it almost in passing, the way you'd mention a printer running low on ink. That's common after menopause, she said, and moved on to the next line on the page. I went home with more questions than answers. And that's really where this started. Here's the part I didn't understand for years. Insulin resistance after menopause isn't really about willpower, or how clean you eat, or how much sugar you allow yourself on a Saturday. It's about a hormone most of us never think about until something goes wrong, and a mechanism nobody explained to me until I went looking for it myself. Let me back up and walk through what was actually happening in my body. Because once I understood the mechanism, the food choices made a lot more sense than they ever did when I was just following a list someone else made. Estrogen does something most of us never learn in school, and definitely never hear about until after menopause hits. It activates receptors in your blood vessels, your muscles, and your fat tissue that make it easier for glucose, sugar, to move out of your bloodstream and into the cells that actually need it for energy. Researchers describe this as a kind of built-in protection. For most of your reproductive life, estrogen is quietly helping your body manage blood sugar in the background, without you doing anything at all, without you even knowing it's happening. When estrogen drops during menopause, that protection doesn't fade slowly, over years, the way some other symptoms do. Studies describe it as disappearing almost entirely, and the effects on blood sugar regulation can show up quickly, sometimes within the same year or two that other menopause symptoms start. This is part of why insulin resistance becomes so much more common after menopause than before it. It's not a character flaw showing up out of nowhere in your 50s. It's a specific hormonal mechanism switching off, one that used to run quietly in the background of every meal you ate. There's real data behind this, not just theory or a general sense that hormones are involved. A meta-analysis pooling 17 randomized controlled trials, covering more than 29,000 postmenopausal women, found that restoring estrogen significantly reduced insulin resistance in healthy women. Both oral and skin-based hormone therapy showed a measurable benefit. I'm not telling you this to push hormone therapy on you. That's a conversation for you and your doctor, based on your own history, not something a YouTube video should be deciding for you. I'm telling you because it proves this isn't in your head, and it isn't a discipline problem. There's a measurable hormonal reason your blood sugar behaves differently now than it did in your 30s. So if the hormone protection is gone, what actually helps fill that gap? This is where I expected the answer to be about cutting things out. Less sugar, less bread, less fruit even, since fruit has natural sugar in it. That's the advice I kept running into every time I searched for help. Some version of eat less of this list. But the research kept pointing somewhere else entirely, and it genuinely surprised me when I first read it. Skeletal muscle is one of the largest metabolic organs in your entire body, even though we rarely think of muscle that way. It's responsible for the majority of glucose disposal after you eat a meal, meaning most of the sugar from your plate gets absorbed into your muscle tissue to be used or stored there, rather than floating around in your bloodstream where it can cause problems. More muscle means more places for that glucose to go, more capacity to clear it efficiently. Less muscle, which happens faster after menopause, whether you exercise or not, means less capacity to handle the same meal you've always eaten. This is the same muscle loss mechanism connected to a slowing metabolism that a lot of us have heard about by now, but it's directly tied to insulin sensitivity too, not just to weight or how your clothes fit. And here's the twist: that changed how I actually eat, not just what I eat. The order and timing of your food matters more than most people realize, maybe more than the specific ingredients themselves. Researchers at Weill Cornell found that eating protein and vegetables before carbohydrates, instead of the reverse, lowered post-meal blood sugar by roughly 30 to 40% compared to eating the exact same meal in the opposite order. That finding has since been repeated in other groups, including people with prediabetes, with similar results. It's not about elimination at all. It's about sequencing what's already on your plate. Timing your carbohydrates around movement, like a short walk after a meal instead of sitting straight down on the couch, also produces steadier blood sugar than eating the same food while staying still. That single shift, protein and fiber first, changed more for me on a daily basis than any food I ever cut out completely. With that mechanism in mind, here are the 5 foods that became part of my routine, and why each one connects back to what I just explained about muscle, fiber, and sequencing. The first is eggs, or another concentrated protein source, at breakfast. Protein slows how quickly your stomach empties food into your bloodstream, which blunts the glucose spike from whatever carbohydrate comes next in the meal. Starting the day with protein, instead of starting with something carbohydrate heavy on its own, like cereal or toast by itself, set the tone for how steady my blood sugar felt for hours afterward. It wasn't about adding a diet food. It was about changing what came first on the plate. The second is legumes: beans, lentils, chickpeas, the foods I used to think of as a side dish at best. They're one of the few foods that combine real protein with real soluble fiber in the same bite, which is a combination that's hard to find elsewhere. Soluble fiber slows glucose absorption directly, and it also feeds the bacteria in your gut that produce compounds linked to better insulin sensitivity over time. I started adding a small serving to lunch instead of treating them as a separate diet food I had to force myself to eat. And it became one of the easiest changes to keep going, mostly because it didn't feel like a sacrifice. The third is fatty fish: salmon, sardines, mackerel, the ones with visible fat in the flesh. The omega-3 fats in these foods are tied to lower inflammation throughout the body. And inflammation is closely connected to insulin resistance in ways researchers are still mapping out. If fish isn't something you eat often, or you simply don't enjoy it, ground flaxseed or walnuts are plant-based alternatives that offer some of the same fats. The fourth is berries, which I added for a different reason than the others. In the most detailed clinical trial I found on this, a controlled study from the USDA's Nutrition Research Center, mixed berries didn't produce a clear, consistent improvement in blood sugar across the board. But a closer look at the data showed a modest reduction in insulin response in that same trial. And other berry studies using higher anthocyanin doses from single berry types have shown clearer improvements in insulin sensitivity. The research here is genuinely mixed, not a slam dunk, which is part of why I don't rely on berries alone. I treat them as one piece of the fiber and flavonoid picture, not a fix on their own. I started having a small bowl after a protein-based meal instead of eating fruit first thing or on an empty stomach, which ties back to that sequencing idea. The fifth is non-starchy vegetables, the ones you can eat a large volume of without much effect on blood sugar at all. Leafy greens, broccoli, peppers, that kind of thing. Filling half my plate with these before I even thought about the carbohydrate portion made the protein and fiber first habit almost automatic after a while, without needing to measure anything or track a single number. None of these 5 foods required me to give up bread, pasta, or fruit entirely. What changed was what came before them on the plate. And sometimes a short walk after eating instead of sitting down right away for the rest of the evening. One more thing worth naming honestly, because it's easy to overlook. Research published in 2023 tracking large groups of adults over time found that higher intake of ultra-processed foods was linked to a greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes, independent of overall calorie intake. That's not about any single food being bad or forbidden. It's about how much of your plate, on average across a week, is coming from foods engineered to be eaten quickly and in large amounts without much fiber or protein to slow things down. That overall pattern matters more than any individual ingredient you could add or remove. Looking back, I spent a long time thinking. Insulin resistance was something I'd have to fight with restriction. Fewer carbs, smaller portions, more discipline at every meal. What actually helped was almost the opposite of that. It was adding protein at the start of meals, adding fiber before the carbohydrate-heavy part of the plate, adding a short walk after eating instead of the couch. The foods I was avoiding for years were rarely the real problem underneath it all. The order I was eating everything else in was. I think about that appointment sometimes, the one where I first heard the phrase insulin resistance said out loud like it was nothing new. In a way, it wasn't new. It's common enough that plenty of doctors mention it in passing, the way mine did. But common doesn't mean explained, and it definitely doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. It just means nobody's usually taking the time to walk you through the mechanism, so it ends up feeling like a life sentence instead of a hormonal shift, with real, researchable ways to work around it. Quick note, I'm not a doctor, and nothing in this video is medical advice. This reflects my own experience and what the research says in general terms, not a diagnosis or a treatment plan for you specifically, since I don't know your history or your labs. Please talk to your doctor before making changes to your diet, especially if you're managing a condition like diabetes or prediabetes already. If you've been trying to fix your blood sugar by cutting more and more out of your plate every year, I don't think the answer is subtraction. I think it's sequence. 5 foods, added in the right order, changed more for me than any list of foods I ever gave up trying to follow.